Welcome, everyone. I am Alyssa Ray, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life, and this is the Week in Sustainability, where our team of practitioners comes together to talk about the hottest topics and going-ons in the news today. So I'm joined here by my colleagues, Nick and Constance. Please both introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hi
I'm
everyone, sorry, Nick.
Go ahead.
Hi everyone, I'm Constance. I'm our Director of Sustainability and I help manage our technical practice.
And I'm Nicholas Sontag. I'm a sustainability manager here at Sustain.Life.
Fantastic. So on today's agenda, we're going to be talking about the EPA and the newest edition of an environmental justice arm, which is a pretty big deal. And then we're going to continue the thread on what's going on with the U.S. Regulatory and court environment, I should say judiciary environment, with some top oil and gas cases going on in the country. So let's kick it off. I think, Constance, did you want to introduce the EPA environmental justice arm?
Sure, yeah, this is a really exciting development. A few sessions ago, we had actually talked about the IRA budgeting for environmental justice issues to the tune of $60 billion. And here is one instance where this is being put into action or this budget is being put to good use. So essentially, the EPA is adding this environmental justice arm. It could affect how grants are distributed, obviously favoring disadvantaged communities, and it can also impact permits. So, permits that are disproportionately disadvantaging minorities could not be renewed or no longer be granted to kind of start addressing these issues. It's a pretty big staff addition of 200 new EPA staffers, but it is also being combined with the existing External Civil Rights Compliance Office and also the Conflict Prevention and Resolution Center, which is mainly concerned about resolving cleanup disputes of, Superfund and similar
Hmm.
sites.
That makes sense. So, do we know these 200 staffers, like how big of the chunk of the 60 billion is this gonna cost? Is there a line item cost for this specific body?
They haven't disclosed it. We could, probably make some guesses, but
Yeah.
not a huge chunk in terms
Yeah,
of
hopefully
of the
not.
size.
Yeah.
So, so just to anchor this is an example of how this could impact permitting. Would this be something along the lines of if there was a new municipal waste facility or something like that to be permitted in a neighborhood, this body would be involved in the permit review process and would be doing work specifically to evaluate or assess, is this impacting, underrepresented communities? Is this an environmental justice issue? Like, is that a fair way to think of how this could be deployed in practice?
And even prior to this office being formed last year, and environmental justice has sort of been growing within the EPA. Before this and last year, the EPA opposed the expansion of like a recycling transfer station in Southeast Chicago. Um, for environmental justice reasons, that it's already an impoverished neighborhood that's subject to a lot of pollution already, and
Yes.
so this is already happening. But
Oh
I
my
think it's
gosh.
it's more things along those lines.
I'm going to have to follow up in comments to this post because there was a really interesting podcast. And of course, I forget what network and when it was and all of that, but it was speaking about the deep rooted environmental justice issues in that part of Chicago. And it was all about waste. It was about this like huge, hazardous, toxic waste facility that was like basically unregulated, like had no standards and just how it was impacting the community. And it was a really interesting story. So I don't have all the details, but I will follow up with them because I remember I mean it was horrifying when you like see how these bad actors are allowed to continue like completely unregulated and the massive impact it has and just like ridiculous. Like how is this happening in the United States of America? This is a completely ludicrous, operation to take place, especially in a major city like Chicago. So I will follow up, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I think another way to also look at these new staffers is that they'll try to bring environmental justice as a topic to all of the other divisions of EPA. So a lot of it is going to be educational. They're not an enforcement body, but they can inform all of these other departments and make sure that environmental justice just becomes more integrated across the entirety of the EPA.
Yeah, I think that's key, and that's something that, we talk about a lot with sustainability is institutionalizing sustainability within your organization. The the most sustainable organization or organization that's doing really well may not have any office of sustainability because it's built into everybody's job descriptions. Um, and I think that's really the key is just to make it normal and
Hmm.
not just this is that office that handles this. No, we all handle this. This is important for everyone.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, not to go off too much on a tangent because we're talking about the judiciary here today and not private business, but I think that is so much of what we're seeing in business is that this, I think we've spoken about this before, but the day of like the siloed independent sustainability office or practice is, soon going to be in the past because it is so clearly being interwoven into how a business operates, how, you need to disclose your financial statements with this proposed SEC rule. And so, just the idea that it's really going to be woven into the very fabric of how the agency acts is so critical in that real transformation, at scale.
Yeah, there's another business parallel too, which is that we're always talking about whom does sustainability report into within a company, and that kind of dictates how much authority or not that department has. And so I think it's really important here with this environmental justice arm that it will report directly into the EPA administrator. So it's going to have some pull.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, that's a good day for USA. I feel like the EPA has had some, some good
Some
moments. It's
wins.
been
Yeah.
what is it? Some wind behind their sails. Okay, awesome. So this story coincides with some really big oil cases that are going on right now, with SCOTUS, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's indirectly related to environmental justice too. It's specific to climate change and climate change liability. But as we know, that also impacts disadvantaged communities in a disproportionate way. So in that way, it's definitely a related topic.
Hmm.
And the gist of it is that, there are a number of large oil companies who are attempting to get state level liability lawsuits around climate change moved to the federal level. So essentially, they're saying we don't want states and municipalities to sue us for having spread climate misinformation. We want all of these cases handled at the federal level. And of course, part of that thinking right now is that, the Supreme Court is pretty conservative. And so the expectation from the oil companies would be that cases kind of play in their favor. And so the Supreme Court currently is thinking about whether to take on that case. And I think it's important to note that 5 federal appeals courts so far have rejected the argument of these big oil companies. So, they're continuing to push for it. And I will say one really good thing that's coming out of it is that, I think some people have been frustrated that the Department of Justice hasn't taken a stance um, on how they compare to the previous administrations in their support of big oil companies. And so this week, the Supreme Court has asked the DOJ to weigh in and publicly state their position. So I think it's a good opportunity for them to finally come out and break with the previous administration's position, or at least that's what we're hoping for.
Wait, this is the Supreme Court, was it, is putting this pressure on DOJ?
It's not so much pressure. It's they're just asking for them to state their formal policy. And I know it sounds like a really unusual thing, but it actually happens all the time that SCOTUS will ask DOJ for input or DOJ will ask SCOTUS for input. So I think that part isn't so unusual. What is unusual is that the current DOJ has actually not made any statements
Right.
about their position.
So they're asking for their position generally on oil companies, or their position on this topic on whether these should be federal cases or state cases.
I think it's a little bit of both. And it kind of makes sense because the DOJ does prosecute federal cases, so it's kind of important to know what their position is in terms of what the laws should be.
Mhm.
But yeah, so it'll be interesting to hear if their statement's going to align with President Biden's and Merrick Garland's previous support of environmental justice issues and also holding polluters accountable.
I'm just thinking of the players in this dynamic, and it's interesting because I feel like you have these oil companies going to the Supreme Court and saying like, "Hey, we think you're going to rule in our favor. We want this to be in your jurisdiction." But then you have this, so like, some vote of confidence, you'd think that they feel more comfortable there than at the state level. Then you have the Supreme Court saying, "Okay, we actually want to know what DOJ has to say about this. We're going to ask them." And so this is like a pretty critical opportunity for DOJ. Like if they come back wishy-washy or unclear or anyway ambiguous, anything other than clear, support for climate action and, the ties here, that is the signal I think to SCOTUS to say like, okay, like we're not getting strong signals from these guys. So, like that to me would be very dangerous in perhaps, I'm not saying there's real sway, but just in demonstrating, a line there. Whereas they have a real opportunity to like very clearly come out against it. It's like anything other than a clear statement here, I think could actually be pretty dangerous and a signal, to the oil companies that they may have a friendlier ear because not actually of the Supreme Court, but because of the precedent or like the line that DOJ actually put out there.
And am I understanding correctly that it would be somewhat unprecedented if the Supreme Court took on this case because all of these cases are, or not all of them, but most of them are pertaining to state laws that were violated, not federal laws. And
Mm-hmm.
normally when, cases get aggregated to the federal level, it's because there have been some federal law breaches that, okay, it makes sense that this just becomes a
Right.
federal case. But in
Yeah.
this case, if the Supreme Court does decide to take it on, it is going to be a little bit outrageous.
That
But
seems totally inappropriate. It seems like there could
Yeah.
either be a parallel case where if they broke other federal laws, like you could then try them in the Supreme Court. But like if it's state level laws that are in question, would it at all be reasonable or logical to try that in any other place besides at the state level?
That's where the irony comes in, right? Because the oil companies are basically saying this is a matter of national importance, and that's why the federal court should rule on this and not state level courts, while at the same time, for years having downplayed or even misinformed the public on the severity of climate change. So I think that's pretty odd. But yeah, Nick, you're 100% correct. It's about tort law. It's about consumer protection laws. These are all state level laws. But I think there's an ultimate motive with what oil companies really want, which is already happening in some states that they're passing these preemptive laws that prevent municipalities from bringing these cases. And so essentially they're looking for blanket immunity from accountability for their activities, which, hopefully based on whether or not SCOTUS rejects what they're asking currently will not happen. But this is also why it's so important to vote at the local level because there are states passing these
Yeah.
laws and municipalities. So it can be pretty consequential.
Oh my gosh, I think we're going to have to get a lawyer on our next podcast to when we dig into this or keep track of the cases.
That would actually be really great.
Would be really cool.
And
All
then
right,
if you,
any
oh yeah,
environmental lawyers out there, reach out to us. Let us know
that's
if you want to
right.
participate in our commentary.
Yeah, just one other thing that I also found pretty interesting, just from a financial perspective, is that obviously the states and there are more than 20 cases pending right now, but they're seeking monetary compensation, obviously, and climate change doesn't affect every state equally. So, for instance, in Delaware, they're really concerned about the impact of sea level rise, and they're estimating that there'll be in excess of $1 billion. Oh, I'm sorry, $1 billion in property damage from sea level rise. And New Jersey is just came up with some estimates in the hundreds of millions for future remediation and adaptation projects, and that's really what they're seeking from the oil companies. So that's another reason why you could see it would be beneficial for that industry to move this all to the federal level. Because obviously a lot of cases would translate into a lot of compensation.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, interesting. All right. That one sounds like a big to be continued. We're going to have to keep a watchful eye on that one. Another one that's happening concurrently, right? What's happening in Montana with the First Kids climate trial?
Yeah, so following on our legal theme, in March 2020, 16 children through an organization called Attorneys with Our Children's Trust, our that's the law firm representing them, filed a case against the state of Montana, claiming that their constitutional rights were violated because of the degradation of the state's natural resources and air pollution, all those things. And it really ties in with how much young people are really leading this movement, starting with
Hmm.
Greta Thunberg. Um, and it also reminded me of, this sort of political thought experiment about what if future generations that don't exist yet could advocate for their lives. And obviously, these children are alive; they already exist. But if you kind of put things in the terms of the number of future people that our decisions and actions will impact, then the benefits become innumerable. And this is something that was raised in a recent novel that came out a couple of years ago called Ministry for the Future, um, which is about a lot of things, but it's about the UN developing this ministry called the Ministry for the Future, and it's this body's job to advocate for people who don't exist yet. Um,
That is interesting.
yeah, I mean, there are even like economists that have tried to put numbers to them as economists do.
Yeah.
Um,
No,
but
that's a
it's
really
an
cool thought
interesting
experiment.
idea. Yeah,
Yeah,
That's
but
really interesting. That would like throw off our whole system of how we do things because we're so, short term, has to be an observed impact, right? Like that's the whole difference between the reaction to the ozone hole and climate change. Ozone hole, like there was an observable physical effect. It wasn't modeled, it wasn't projected, like this thing was
right.
happening. And so society was able to like pretty quickly get laws in place and policies and ban chemicals and really act to address that issue, whereas climate change, you can't see it, you can't necessarily pinpoint it, or at least at the time that such advocacy
Yeah.
around it really came to be.
And it's really it's a core part of sustainability, right? Sustainability is all about using our resources responsibly so that future generations can, live the lives
Yes.
that we have.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, it's interesting to think about, and obviously the cost benefit completely gets tipped when you frame things that way.
yeah, I'm also entirely in favor of this ministry, but I am also skeptical that if we can't get people to care about, just one generation out, how are we going to get
Right.
them to care about multiple generations out?
Yeah. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a fair point.
yeah. I think
'Cause-
I
it's not
guess
an
we're all going to be
effective.
living on Mars anyway by then, right?
I don't know. Hopefully not. But yeah, it's not an effective emotional argument, but it is a effective logical argument, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, yes. I like it as a logical argument, and like I like the idea of economic analyses and studies actually putting some quantitative figures behind that.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, cool. All right, I think we had a really tight US what's going on regulation judiciary chat today. I hope everyone found it as interesting as we did, frankly. So we will see you next week for more commentary on the week's sustainability news. Bye, everyone.
Everyone.